Good morning, everybody. Today, we have a special session in the sense that a topic which is very much in the statute book for more than nearly 20 years, but still deliberations are on and still it has become a point for debate. Though it is debatable, it's very much interesting. And so also the resource person who are assembled here to deliberate on the topic is about electronic records, how and why everything. And it will be on a technical aspect and a legal aspect. Both of them are expert in the particular field. As Napinem has already given the what is called the design of the program, it will go. And before that, let me just speak a few words about Ma'am Napine. Napinai, a beautiful name in Tamil. We should be very proud of the name also. Is practicing before the Supreme Court of India, and she is a founder of Cyber Sati. She's a senior and renowned lawyer with about nearly 29 years of practice, specializing in constitutional, criminal, IPR, and cyber laws. She is amicus curiae before the Supreme Court in the famous Prajwala case to formulate methodologies to remove child sexual abuse material and violent videos of offences against women from online platforms. And she is an advisor for Maharashtra Cyber Police also. Ms. Napine represented the government of Kerala in the recent decision of the Kerala High Court on data protection in Balu Gopalakrishna State of Kerala and others in April 2020. Ms. Napine is part of the governmental committees dealing with various policy issues on cyber laws. She has presented herself before the Lok Sabha Parliamentary Committee on Women Empowerment, on Cyber Safety Online, and she has presented before the National Cyber Security Center, part of the Prime Minister's Office on India's proposed National Cyber Security Policy 2022-2025. And she has deliberated on governmental committees such as expert on cryptocurrencies and blockchain, amendments to the Information Technology Act 2000, and electronic evidence. And she has contributed, and she is contributing, to be frank, extensively to the drafting of India's Commercial Codes Act 2015 and the related amendments. Napine was an expert member, Tamil Nadu Child Policy Committee 2015 to 16, for formulating the cybersecurity aspects under the state child policy. An alumna of Stanford CDDRL, Chevening UK, and IVLP USA, Napine trains judges, police, armed forces, and intelligence agencies at national and state academies and has addressed sessions in national and international conferences too. She has given an inspirational TEDx show on becoming fearless and showing up. Napine is a prolific writer. I'm very glad to say that I have been following her articles in various law journals who of contributions on leading publications and has authored the seminal book on cyber laws titled Technology Laws Decoded. Her books on cyber safety and emerging technologies is forthcoming very shortly. And let us move to the another resource person, Mr. Yogendra Yadav. Mr. Yogendra Yadav is a director of the company I have already mentioned. He has thorough understanding of hardware and data recovery, evidence handling, chain of custody, and evidence storage and use of cell media, forensic cloning, more important, and imaging techniques. That is why he is here to speak of the technical aspects of this topic. And he is proficient with e-discovery tools called EnCase, Forensic Toolkit FTK, Winex, Passware, Internet Evidence Finder, Intella, Nix, etc. He has a solid forensic writing abilities he has got on data analysis, general and technical presentation and summation. He has got in-depth knowledge of FAT and NFTS file system structures and methods of data recovery. He has got extensive knowledge of Windows, Linux, and Mac operating systems. He has got comprehensive knowledge of PC-based hardware and good understanding of network protocols and network devices. And he is focused on the use of procedural policies in checklists in forensic practice and is able to work independently, exhibiting sound judgments and discussion. This is the good word we had about Mr. Yogendra Yadav. And with this short and sweet introduction, I think this is sufficient for the time being because they speak for themselves with their works and their speeches. And may I request Ms. Napine to introduce the topic of the day and her own way of living things. Ma'am, you are welcome.
Thank you, sir. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you all for having me in this session. It always makes me feel good when I'm addressing my southern brethren. It may seem a little strange when I start a session on electronic evidence with this statement, but for all you youngsters out there, this is my first word of advice when it comes to the practical application and reliance on electronic records in legal proceedings. Please ignore the word electronic. Please ignore the word electronic in electronic evidence or electronic records. All of you may say, then why should we bother staying on for this session? She's already told us just ignore it, right? Let's all go back home to our whatever we do at home nowadays, right? But the catch here is this. When I say ignore the word electronic, what do I mean? What happens, and I've seen this across the board, whether we were addressing judges or police or any of these specific audiences, that the minute you include a prefix like electronic or cyber, there seems to be a mental block where we think that somehow this is a very different world. It's a different field that you're not familiar with, and therefore you should fear it. Therefore, where possible, avoid it. But that's not really what it is about. I belong to the generation which was not born to electronic or cyber. I am what Prensky calls a digital immigrant. Most of the faces I see before me, especially the young panelists we have with us for today, all of you youngsters are born to this field of electronics, right? You are the digital natives. So to you, what comes naturally may seem very alien to us, and especially with our generation, we may think, oh, this is not something we can understand. You give us any kind of, complex issue with respect to paper-related evidence or evidence, oral evidence also, hearsay evidence, and all those complex situations which we have been dealing with for generations now, we can handle that. The minute you say electronic evidence, it's something so complicated we cannot handle. But that's the myth I want to burst with today's session. I want to walk you all through what is similar with respect to evidence. Not electronic or non-electronic, but evidence per se in terms of what we are already familiar with, where courts have already elaborately dealt with interpretation, etc. And how can we draw on this wealth of knowledge that we already have with respect to evaluation of evidence in terms of electronic. And of course, there is a little bit of digression. No discussion can happen without us going into the realm of section 65A and B. So with that, we will also be capturing what are the distinctions or the differentiators with respect to electronic evidence. But the whole intent and purpose is to burst the myth that this is something so difficult that you're better off avoiding, and to encourage all of you to rely on what the Supreme Court in Tommaso Bruno also said as the best evidence. So that's the introduction for today's session. Over to you, Mr. Srinivasan.
I just request Mr. Yogendra Yadav to give his perspective of the topic.
So, thank you, sir, and thank you for the introduction. So it's very common for us being a technical person when we come and we have to interact with the legal people, advocates, and all. And what I see basically is it is very difficult from a technical point to explain the people, so like what the technicalities are. And also we always say that electronic media is something which is like very fragile. If we don't take care in the beginning itself at the incident response, okay, so there are many times where people have altered the electronic evidences, and they have presented it in the court. And then it becomes very late to prove whether that this particular file has been altered or not. Then we have to find out the source of those. So right now, as far as my experience goes, like for the past, I have been in this business for 16 years, handling the electronic evidences with the government and all. So nowadays, yes, people have given value to the methodology of an electronic evidence. They are encouraging different methods so that the electronic evidence cannot be tampered. Okay, and they are storing it in a place so that it is tampered proof. But gone, like in previous years, we used to see, like, hard disk or a storage media. They used to bring it for a seizure. They used to just throw it. Okay, in the police and the law enforcement agencies. So they used to throw it in the malkhana. And when the time used to come, when we have to give a expert opinion whether that particular hard disk is working or not, and then nothing, the hard disk is not working, and the whole evidence what we have retrieved, everything is equal to zero.
So this is what you want to dwell to today.
Yes.
Okay. Now may I request Indisai Sugumaran.
Ma'am, my first question is to how to protect the electronic evidence without tampering from its original form, ma'am. And what are the methods we can adapt for it, ma'am?
Well, that sounds more like a technical question, but let me address it from the legal aspect, and then I will ask Yogendra to chip in on that. When you're talking about, see, you have actually raised one of the most important aspects about evidence itself, and definitely electronic evidence. I'll answer this with one example. So we were, and this is also a warning to all of you in terms of what should you look out for as advocates when you are introducing electronic evidence, or what can you, or what should you look for, not just can, but what should you look for when you are the other side in a civil or criminal proceeding in terms of evaluating electronic evidence. So this was a civil case in which emails were relied on by the defendant. Now, when we saw the emails to begin with, and the papers were with the client, these are emails which are supposedly exchanged between the plaintiff and the defendant, and therefore the defendant should have been conversant with the document. What happened was the defendant assumed it was the same document that he had received. He did not really look through the contents. When we were reading and rereading, and this is again something I keep telling my colleagues in office, that one reading is never sufficient for any case. So we always read it multiple times, because as with a book, every time you read, a new angle comes up. So when I was reading it multiple times, somewhere, the antennae went up. All these training sessions actually come to help us the most. So what I noticed was that the email copies that were being relied on in the plaint were forwarded copies. See, it's a printer. It could have been even a Word document for all it mattered, right? So how do you evaluate whether a document is tampered with or not? At the first instance, you need to see what is the copy that is being furnished to you, where has the copy been taken from, and the source of that copy. Could that have been modified? Once you answer these questions, you will also then start digging further to verify whether the document or the copy that has been introduced is a true and correct reproduction or not. So once I noticed that in one instance it was a forwarded mail, and in another instance it was actually a Word document, immediately my antennae went up, and one, of course, we asked for these originals in the inspection, but I also asked my client to then produce the copies received and sent, because these were email communications back and forth. So I asked for the copies from his inbox or outbox respectively. Once we got that copy and we verified, we were able to see that the changes were not minute. It was substantial. Now, in a situation like this, imagine on one hand is the problem with respect to fraudulent documents having been placed before a court of law or a tampered document. But more importantly, imagine the kind of embarrassment that a lawyer has to face when some issue like this is brought before a court. Because at the first level, when you are for the plaintiff and you're relying on electronic records, you have to make sure that there has been no tampering. So you have to do the first level verification. Don't just take anything that a client gives to you. Ask to check. So since we are starting off with emails, again, I am intruding a little bit on Yogendra's domain here, but just to give the basic layperson input on it, and I'll leave it to Yogendra to fill in the more detailed technical responses on this. Look for the headers. Read the headers. The headers are available for all of you to see. Many times in sessions, people ask me, so for everything, including even the, how do we rely on electronic documents? Do we have to take an, forensic expert even when we are putting together the documents and all is another question that comes up. So you don't really have to do that. Here we are giving you that guiding note right away. Look at the headers, see the path, read always from bottom up because you will get the full history of the email then. Look at the path, look at the sender's name, the receiver's name, the date, all those details which are put there. You would have already become a small forensic expert in that itself. You would be able to verify the genuineness or otherwise of the mail. Even when we are falling prey to phishing attacks, spreading of malware and all that, here is a very good way for you to protect yourself also. So this is an advice, not just from the perspective of practitioners, but also from the perspective of users. So once you go and check the header, you will know whether you should even click that link which says otherwise 1 lakh rupees from your account will be taken away by the income tax department. You will know our income tax department may be bad, but they're not that bad, right? So therefore, exercise caution. Remember, and this is why I told you, and here is the first lesson on why I told you, forget the word electronic. See, when our client brings us documents, we will first ask for the original. We'll then verify it with a copy. If they produce only a copy, we'll ask them what happened to the original. Many times we will ask them to put it in writing if they say they don't have the original, etc. So we take these precautions automatically as practitioners. But the minute it comes to electronic evidence, you assume you're not in a position to verify whether it's tampered or not, and therefore you don't even check. So that's not what should be there. Exercise the same caution you would for other documents for electronic also. Yogendra, would you like to come in on the technical aspects?
Yeah. So, see, this is what is the first step. Now, what happens? Suppose a particular mail has been sent, or a particular computer or a particular laptop, I feel like, has been targeted, or a particular fraud has been committed. Okay. So what we try to do, we just log on to that particular system, start analyzing by our own self, okay, searching for files, doing search, opening the browsers, everything. We start doing analysis. Okay. So as a forensic expert, I will just say you that don't do anything on that particular system. Remove it from the network. Okay. Remove the network cable. Keep it aside. If it is switched off, let it be switched off. If it is on, let it be on, or depending upon the case. Now, suppose if it is a malware case, okay, now malware has infected your system. So we'll try to find out from where it has entered. And we have to stop it to spread it onto other systems. So what we try to do is, suppose you remove it from the network and the system is isolated. When I say remove it from the network, yes, network cable, Wi-Fi, everything, it should not connect it to the outside world. It should be working as a standalone system. Then if the expert is available, take his help. If not, if you can bring the system down, then remove the power supply from that particular system so that it abruptly closes, or if it is a laptop, press the power button. Now, when we do this, after this, what the forensic experts do is make a mirror image of that particular storage media. Okay. Now, when we make a mirror image, it is exact replica of that particular hard disk, and nobody is allowed to work on the original evidence, right? Here we call it as a primary evidence in legal terms. All the working of an forensic examiner or an expert is done on the replica mirror image, and that's how you seize it, seize the primary one, and then comes on the analysis part and all. So in the beginning, whenever such situation happens, now same is true for the mobile phones. Now a particular case I can just tell you, just few weeks back, there's a person who got alert from his Instagram saying that your Instagram has been updated. Click on the link to login. So he clicked it. He got again user ID and password it asked, and he had to put his user ID and password. Okay. Now, when after doing that, what in the night he came to know there are various chat messages sent to n number of people from his particular system. Now, when we went on to that particular place, that lady had already opened her Instagram account on her home PC and on her laptop also. So she has not only given the mobile phone access to the hacker, she had also given access of his personal laptop, of her home PC also, and all the data, her user ID, password, everything was compromised. Now, when we come to know about this, first thing is remove it from the network, remove it from the Wi-Fi, then try to find out which was the first place where she logged in. Okay, now they are not, people think that, okay, from the desktop I logged in. So we tried to find out from the desktop. We found that from the desktop, no, it is not the first source. Then she says, oh, I remember I had clicked out from my mobile. Now, when we checked the mobile history, yes, we found that there are some of the ROGU files which are present, and they are like sniffing out the data outside. Now, even in the corporates, what happens? Suppose an attack is there, or suppose a particular case of data theft has happened. Now, the case will come, or the people will connect us after 1 year, after 2 years, and they will say it to us saying that, okay, can you check whether data has been lost from this particular system? Now, the case has happened already in 2018 or 2019. We are in 2020, and the systems are being running day in, day out. So there are a lot of times what happens because of this, the overwritten files are more, which destroys the evidences which are present inside that hard disk. That's why when we go as an incident response, first thing is take the custody of that particular system, isolate that particular system so that nobody is accessing it, make a mirror image of that particular system, and go ahead. Now you are like, it will not spread to other systems.
It's a good answer, and it's very, I would rather say that both of you have hit the nail. Thank you very much. And may I now request Akshaya. Akshaya, you can pose your question.
Hi, ma'am. I have a question for you. An elementary but essential aspect that we want to hear your thoughts on is the difference in treatment under law of electronic evidence from other documentary evidence. You mentioned earlier that we need to draw on the existing principles that we have on appreciation of evidence as such. And we also see this trend through the decision in Shafi Mohammed, where it has now been held that we can also fall back on the general mode of proof contained in 62 and 63. So what is the additional burden that we need to keep in mind for relying on and proving electronic evidence?
So thank you. So I'm going to start with the latter part of what you said first, and then move to the former part. Okay, because as I already mentioned, it's impossible for us to have a conversation on electronic evidence without touching upon 65A and B. So just to give a background, so now here is where the difficulty is when we talk about the delineation between evidence and electronic evidence, and what does the law say for it, and how far can we really today in current circumstances rely on general principles. In Navjot Sandhu, the first step of interpretation of 65B4 for the certificate was raised, where they said that you do not have to rely on it, you may rely on it as a discretionary process. And then said that 63 and 65, and therefore consequently all the tried and tested methodologies for relying on evidence would sustain. The move, we jump forward to Anwar versus Bashir nearly 10 years later, where Navjot Sandhu was overruled, where they said no, 65A and B are special laws, and naturally special overrules general, and therefore you have to rely only on 65A and B for electronic evidence. The qualifier here is that the special provisions that are set out in 65B are applicable only if you're relying on secondary evidence, meaning copies of electronic records. So if you're relying on the original electronic record itself, then the certificate is not necessary. Compliance with all those complicated aspects of 65B are not necessary. You can just rely on the original assets. So this is the qualifier, that it applies only when you're dealing with a copy. I am not going to spend time on nomenclature with respect to, is it secondary evidence, is it primary, or is it special secondary, etc. Because ultimately when you're talking about it practically, that becomes irrelevant. However, in my book, I've called it special secondary because it cannot be denied that it is a copy and therefore automatically falls into the realm of secondary. But because it is dealt with under a special provision, I've called it as special secondary. We jump forward to Shafi Mohammed. And in between, what came in handy were High Court judgments. So you will get the entire flow and catena of judgments in my article, which I wrote for SCC. I'm just trying to look for the citation. I will just share that in a short while. But
it is there on, it is dated on 28/3/2019. Electronic evidence, the great Indian quagmire, right?
I'll just post it on the chat, the citation.
Okay, yeah.
But if you look at that, you will get all the judgments. And what was important was there were so many questions that were not answered in Anwar. They merely said the special provision will apply and left it at that. Only saving grace where there was that they did clarify that you only had to give the certificate to the best of your knowledge. That's all. So what happened to 10 years of cases which relied on Navjot Sandhu? In Sonu versus State of Haryana, the Supreme Court said it could have done prospective overruling. In the
Unbest.
there is already a precedent for that. In Bharat Aluminium, they did. In so many other cases they've done. They could have done it, but they did not do it. But it was a two-judge bench, so they did nothing. So the reason I'm pointing out Sonu, and also I'll come to Shafi Mohammed, but in between, before I forget it, go to one of the finest judgments which came in very handy and helpful was from the Madras High Court. Please refer to the Ramajayam judgment. It gives you almost answers to everything in terms of when should you give the certificate. You have to give it at the time of trial. If you have not given it before that, during the seizure of the document, during filing of charge sheet, or during filing of a plaint, during ad interim reliefs in civil cases, or during bail hearings in criminal cases, it does not matter. It does not impact or vitiate the electronic evidence. What is needed is only at the time of trial. Subsequent judgments of the Supreme Court, including Ravindra Desai's case recently, point out that in case you haven't given earlier also, it doesn't matter. Giving of the certificate is a curable defect. So you can give it at any point of time. Sonu also laid down a very important guideline that if the other side has not objected to the document at the time of trial, they cannot raise the technicality of absence of a certificate at a subsequent stage of appeal, etc. So this was an important judgment which overcame one of the biggest problems of 10 years of gap where it was only shown as discretionary. Now we come to Shafi Mohammed where they took into account an important aspect. And why was Shafi Mohammed needed? Because if you read 65B4, I have my recent article on this based on the hearing in a subsequent case of Arjun Pandit Rao, which is going on before the Supreme Court. I wrote this article and titled it The Tale of Two Ennies, from Anwar to Arjun, A Tale
Anwar
of
to
Two
Arjun.
Ennies. It almost sounds like a movie title, but I just thought it sounded very catchy. So
Yeah.
the reason why I said that is if you go to 65B4, the first thing it says is that if you want to rely on an electronic evidence during trial, you may produce any of the following. And it sets out three things. One is to technically identify the document to show that it is a computer output. The second is to identify the device and the manner in which it was created, again, with the same purpose, to show that it is a computer output. And only the third NE, which is 65B4C, is for compliance with 65B2. And the second NE there comes there, where in 65B4C, the section says you may prove any of the conditions in 65B2. But when you take Anwar, they ignored both NEs and they said you have to prove all of them.
All.
So technically, you have to prove 5 conditions, and that's how they interpreted it. I don't blame them. If you go to 65B2, it starts off with something which says the conditions set out in 65B4, 65B1 are as follows. And then they say A, B, C, and you have an and only at the end of C. So my interpretation was that technically if you look at it, because they say the conditions are the following, it could be interpreted, and possibly that's why Anwar interpreted it like that, but all these discussions are not there in Anwar, that it is all of them. I have interpreted it to show why it cannot still be all. Because my way of interpreting is, one could still say D is mandatory because of the and at the end of C. But when we look at legislative interpretations, where the legislature has consciously used and in one place and not in each subclause, it cannot be imputed there. So therefore, 65B4 has to be ideally interpreted as any because of the following. One, you have the any of or 3 different kinds of documents. And 2, you also have a proviso which says that this certificate has to say to the best of knowledge of the deponent that this system is working properly, it is not being disrupted where it can harm the contents or the authenticity or integrity of the document, etc., right? So then when you're dealing with documents which you have created as an author, or you're dealing with a document which is received by you, then you're in a position to give these statements. But if you're dealing with third-party documents, so you're relying on a post made by somebody, let's say on Twitter, you're not in control of the Twitter system. You can't go and ask Twitter for a 65B4 certificate. They're not going to give it to you. And you have to rely on it because let's assume that it's a case of defamation. And you are the primary evidence for that is that Twitter statement that has been made. So how will you rely on that document if what Anwar said was correct? So Shafi Mohammed came into picture to say that if it is a document within your custody, we are totally with Anwar versus Bashir. And therefore, yes, you must give the certificate. But if it is a document which is not in your custody, then how are you going to give the certificate and say to the best of your knowledge it's valid? Therefore, it doesn't apply to third-party documents. then 63 and 65 will apply, which will be that you can give a notice to produce to Twitter to say, give us the original or give us a certificate, whatever you will, oblige. And if they don't, then you're allowed to rely on secondary evidence subject to you proving all the other aspects of 63 and 65. Now, when you go into Shafi Mohammed, the problem is it's a 2-judge bench and not a 3-judge bench. And therefore, they could not overrule Anwar, but what they did was this ingenuity of distinguishing from Anwar. And through this ingenuity, they tried to make it easier for litigants to rely on third-party documents. My input here would be that even with this regard, until Arjun Panditrao, and Arjun Panditrao was merely a reference. Again, it was before a 2-judge bench. It's a civil appeal. And there the courts felt that this was an issue which has to be decided. And here is the difficulty. And this is what I've covered in from Anwar to Arjun. The reference is made saying 2 things. One is that since Shafi Mohammed is a 2-judge bench, this is an issue that has to be decided. But there is a subsequent statement in the reference which says that with every legal proceeding relying on electronic evidence, it is mandatory that there is certainty to such reliance. So that part seems to have been missed out in the reference because the reference is before a 3-judge bench. And my article argues that it cannot be decided by a 3-judge bench because a 3-judge bench cannot distinguish or overrule Anwar. And with the reference being given to a 3-judge bench, they are assuming that Anwar is right and Shafi Mohammed may or may not be, and therefore a 3-judge bench has to decide. But what should have been done is a reference to a larger bench so that the issues that have been raised in Anwar as well as those raised in Shafi Mohammed are dealt with. Now here it brings me therefore to the first part of your question. I'm trying to actually cover what people would in an entire session on 65B here so that we can move on to other things. Okay, so sorry for a pretty long answer here, but I'm trying to make it as comprehensive as possible here. So let's move back to the first part of your question in terms of what are the similarities and what are the distinctions. I always start with these 3 ground rules for evidence. This is what we were taught, this is what we followed all these decades, and this is what I would want all of you all to also take into account and follow, whether it's evidence or electronic evidence. Authenticity, integrity, non-repudiation. We may not have used the same words, but the intent and purpose of the exercise of introducing evidence has always been the same. We rely on an original because it's admitted into evidence because it is authentic. If it is, we rely on the original because it shows the integrity of the contents, that it has not been tampered with, that it has not been modified, and if there is a modification, it will be visible. Because many times when we ourselves rely on these originals, right? We are served a copy. Immediately, what do we do in our office? You will put a chapa, you will record who has received it, on what date and what time. So the copy you received is the original, which is served on you. But you have made a change to that original. But that change is a visible change. So you know how many hundreds of thousands of times would we have done this exercise with a paper document, where we would prove the document and how and its genesis, who created it, how was it done, how did it come into your hands, the chain of custody. So the author, the recipient, the chain of custody, and in this chain of custody, what has this document's journey been? What all has happened to it? So we will prove every single step of this process for this document to just be taken on record and marked in evidence. If you look at electronic evidence now, it follows exactly the same path. So when you take 65B4A, B or C, and if you take all of 65B2 and you analyze that in the light of authenticity and integrity, you will realize that what the draftsman was really trying to do was to be able to show that a copy that you're relying on is authentic it is the same as the original, which is also captured in your 65 in terms of mechanical reproductions, etc. And that the contents, the integrity of the contents have been maintained. And this is why I really appreciated Yarini's first question, because that now ties in with your question in terms of how do you rely on electronic documents. So follow the same methodology you would have for, general evidence. Tick every box which we would, for regular evidence in terms of establishing chain of custody and the authenticity and integrity of the document, and then you cannot go wrong. And the final statement here, which is why I did not want today to be all about 65B. Everybody forgets that 65A and B are only the threshold. It is only for you to get this document into the court as an exhibit. But you still haven't proven your case. Merely because the document is marked as an exhibit, it does not prove the truth of the contents. It proves the integrity of the contents, meaning that the contents have not been modified. But the truth still has to be proven through evidence. You have to corroborate and show that what is contained in an email, what is contained even in a message, WhatsApp message, is true and correct, and that you have to lead evidence for that. So here is where the similarities, again, it's like, I always tell people, it is like a detour. So you are in the same path as any other evidence. You have a small detour where you will go to 63, 65, etc. for regular secondary evidence. You will go into 65A and B for electronic evidence, and it joins again. And then you still have to prove the contents exactly the way you have to in any other case. So this is the reason, again, the second reason why I said, forget about the word electronic. If you apply first principles, you cannot go wrong. Apply electronic only where the detour happens, but don't forget it. Don't forget first principles otherwise.
Thank you, Napini ma'am. A very exhaustive, but very much pointed answer. And I think there can be no more doubts on this aspect. May I now request Vyarini Ganapati to pose her first question. Vyarini, you are welcome.
Yes, I'd like to post my question to Sir. Sir, can you share some useful tips on how to rely on electronic records and legal proceedings?
What happens in the legal part? Now, when we are talking of phones, mobile phones, which are storing data, okay? Now, I'll tell you a simple scenario. In one particular case, mobile phone was seized. Okay, it's not seized, it was taken in the custody, saying that this particular mobile contains some data which it is having good evidential value. Okay, it was kept in a locker and key till the forensic experts came. Now, when the forensic experts reached the premises, that particular place, they saw the message on that particular mobile phone. Okay, they unlocked it, and the message they saw is welcome to your iPhone. Okay, choose the language, English, then go ahead, choose the network. So you know what had happened in this? The moment the particular officer who had taken in custody of that particular mobile phone, he forgot to put the handset in an airplane mode. Okay, and he just kept it in a locker and key. So the person whose mobile phone was seized, what he did was he told his friend to log on to his iCloud, and there is an option to select I lost my phone. So erase all the data. No doubt the physical mobile handset was in custody of the officer, but the whole handset was erased from a different location. Right? Now, that is why when we talk of digital evidence, first thing is when you find out that something authentic, it is present, at that particular moment itself, you have to save it so that nobody is able to access it physically or electronically. Okay, disable enable airplane mode so that it doesn't communicates with the outside world, and take a snapshot or a photograph of that particular scenario, that this is important, which we had captured it. Now then comes the second thing of authentication. Now that's why what we do, make a mirror image of that particular mobile phone or that particular system. Now, when we do a mirror image, there is a report which comes up, which says that at this particular time, this particular laptop bearing serial number, bearing the, configuration of the laptop, and inside that particular laptop, this particular hard disk. So model number, serial number of that particular hard disk has been mirror imaged at this particular time. It took so much time to mirror image, and this is the hash value. Now hash value is one technical term. I'll just explain you what is an hash value. Now when we talk of anything you want to authenticate, okay, that this particular document which has been prepared has not been modified once it is been in my custody, what we do is you generate a hash value of that particular document. Now hash value is nothing but it depends a 32 character alphanumeric value. Okay, the moment that particular file has been modified or a particular full stop has been removed from that particular file, what it will do is the hash value will not match. Okay, the hash value will change. Now whatever you do right now, we use the hash value of MD5 or SHA-256. These are names of the algorithms which generate this particular hash value. Now when you have generated it and it is not matching it, this means that this particular document has been tampered. It can be true for a laptop also, for a mobile phone also, right? So in order to have your whatever hard disk or evidence to be producible in the code or acceptable, you have to make a mirror image, you have to support it with the hash value report. Now hash value report can be of a single file also, or it can be of the whole hard disk also. What we suggest basically is, first the hash value of the whole hard disk has to be generated, and when you analyze it, then the important files which are there, those files hash value should be also mentioned in that particular report.
Akshaya, what's your next question?
Yes, sir. Ma'am, another question for you. Keeping aside the possibility of finding inadequacies in a certificate presented by the prosecution, can you throw some light on how one can counter or contradict electronic evidence from the defense's perspective?
Well, that's a very important question, actually, because we always keep talking from the prosecution side, more so with, both Yogendra and I have given many sessions together. We always are talking to judges or police, so we forget that this is the more important side, particularly with all of us being defense lawyers.
And the defense counsel majority here.
Yeah, I am one of them. In practice, I'm only a defense lawyer.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
See, it's actually a mirror image. All you have to do is take all the ground rules we just spoke about as the do's and don'ts for prosecution in terms of, if you're going to rely on electronic evidence, what should you do? You will first check the authenticity and integrity of the document. You will then check the chain of custody. Then you will ensure that the chain, every link to the chain is properly addressed. And then you will rely on it, right? In the same fashion, just reverse it when you're from the defense side. Start looking for the chinks in these armor. Unfortunately, in today's time as it stands, the situation is still a lot easier for defense rather than for prosecution, because there are too many slips between the cup and the lip. You take from the earliest case of Gajraj, as I have been doing earlier, as I mentioned a matter, I will also post the citation, and thank you, Mr. Srinivas Raghavan, for chipping in on all these. I
Thank you.
noted that in the chat.
Mm.
So what happened was, this was a murder case where they found a mobile phone to have been in the last seen together thing, So when the rule is, when it is last seen together, the person last seen with the victim will have to also, there is an onus on the accused also. Now the situation here is, already it was not the mobile of the accused. It was the mobile of the wife, if I'm not mistaken, of the accused. And in search and seizure, this is where the biggest slip between the cup and lip always happens, So in search and seizure, the way they had noted down the IMEI number, the last 2 digits varied. So the whole issue became about, can such evidence be relied on when there is an obvious error in investigation? So you will find not just one, but many cases where, and Gajraj is one of the earliest in that, and you have a lot of high court decisions also on it, where the courts, one, have not allowed technical errors by investigators to come in the way of evaluating the evidence. In this Gajraj case, in spite of this, they relied only on the expert's witness to show how and in what circumstances the last 2 digits could be different. And therefore, they still went ahead and relied on this situation as a strong ground for upholding the conviction. But these are the rare instances. 90% of cases, if you see, every technical mistake in search and seizure is what is relied upon to either reject the electronic evidence or result in acquittals. So the defense job may seem easy, but it's not always so, because as and when mistakes are happening. See, this is where what Yogendra mentioned in his response to the first question becomes very important. We have had some very, very funny instances in early days. I'm talking about 2003-4. One of the earliest things that we came across was, those are the days of CPUs. So here is a constable carrying the CPU on his shoulder. You have to have a visual effect of it. So I'm actually acting it out for you here. So he's carrying the CPU on his shoulder, and then he's taking it to the forensic lab. And on the way, he sees this road show, and he's happily standing there for a minute and enjoying it. He stood right next to the loudspeaker. So by the time he reached the forensic lab, there was no electronic evidence
At all.
There are even more funny instances which we have had shares of, where, records, and see, these are all very standard for us as lawyers, to relate to. When you're filing a petition before the High Court, when proceedings are going on before the trial court, RNP, records and proceedings are sent to the High Court, right? And in proper diligent form, in one case, the person stitched the CD also and sent it over.
Very strange.
Yeah, you have so many fascinating stories that come up because of all these, the lack of awareness about this domain. But these are slowly reducing because of 2 reasons. I always used to keep telling people that we will have to address issues on technology only for a short while. We are going to have to move to addressing on law in a very short while, because only till the digital immigrants or judges or police we had to address on the technical aspect. Now, you're all very familiar with technology. We only have to stick to the law now, right? When we are addressing you. So the shift over has already happened with more awareness about technology and all that. But there are still so many complicated issues that arise in each and every case. So what I would say is, we cannot have a session on electronic evidence where we can give you a kind of handbook of do's and don'ts and do this, do that, or this is the best way. These are the 10 questions you can ask in cross-examination, etc. We can do it, but it won't help you much. The best way to go about it is learn the methodology, not the specifics. Once you know the methodology of what is it that you have to look for when you have to counter an electronic record as evidence, then you will get your answers. So just to take off from what Yogendra stopped with about hash value and all that. See, when Yogendra talks, he talks like me with passion. So he will get very technical. Let me try and just lighten that to layperson terms, like you and what you and I can relate to. You think of those cone filters, you know, where we will put something on top and a small bit will drip out from the bottom. So like a funnel, right? So hash value is nothing but that funnel. So you have terabytes, you have gigabytes, you have whatever bytes of data out there. If we have to verify the integrity and authenticity of each of that, we have to match paper to paper, copy to copy. It is impossible. So for instance, you know, all kinds of strange experiments happen when it comes to the electronic world, okay? So one of the crazy experiments somebody did was, if I printed all the data from one computer, how much space will it occupy? He said that it occupies 3 stories, okay, 3 stories height of one football field. And if we are talking about giant servers, imagine how many football fields we need. So how do you ensure the authenticity and integrity of that electronic record? And here the electronic record could be, let's say, this document, right? So if I have to prove the electronic record of the contents in this hard drive, how will I do it? I will do it by first creating this hash value, which is nothing but cryptography, which makes a small code for the entire content of this device, and says that even if you just plug it in again, it will then change the hash value. And the hash value is so sensitive, you change one full stop. So this is an exercise we do when we do the session physically, you know. I will put just one sentence saying, my name is n.s.napinnan, okay? And then I remove n dot and I say, my name is ns napinai ... So the number of characters in that sentence is the same, because the n dot s dot is 2 dots, which I've moved to the end of the sentence. Shouldn't the hash value be the same then? It won't be, because when it reads like we read paper, you know, unless you're reading Arabic, which will be right to left, we would read like this, right? Left to right, left to right. So the same way, this the cryptography algorithm reads it like this in line. So even when you change one character from place A to place B, it recognizes that and changes the hash value. So today, when you go online, you will already read a lot about how even this, you know, the SHA-1, which is the way we used to deal with in terms of proving hash value, etc., has been compromised. All that may happen, but the person who's claiming something to have been compromised has to prove that. So until and otherwise it is proven that it has not been compromised, you can still use hash value as a safe ground for relying on a record and its integrity and authenticity. This also answers one of the questions which was in the chat box about cloned copies. Now, whenever forensic evidence is done, forensic investigations are done, no forensic investigation is done on the original. The way a forensics will be done is, you will take the original device and, like Yogendra mentioned, see what he pointed out, he was trying to fill in a lot of information in the 2 minutes, but now I'm trying to deconstruct it and give you the legal relevance of it here. He talked about how when you are seizing a computer, you have to seize it in the same manner in which it is found. So your Panchnama has to record whether the computer has been seized when it was alive or in a closed form, was it in sleep mode or shutdown mode. Everything is important, because the minute you shut down a live computer, it changes the hash value. Every time it is rebooted, it changes the hash value. Why does it do that? because every action you perform on any electronic device will create a metadata of that action. And therefore, the minute you have new data added to the computer device, it doesn't distinguish between the document you created as a Word document and the data that it is automatically generating. All that it recognizes is the total data in this device has changed. And therefore, what he mentioned, and this will also answer your question in terms of what should the defense look out for. Are there any changes in hash value? Does the hash value of the original, which has to be taken before the forensics person will take the mirror image copy? So when you use the word clone, be very careful, because a cloning can happen in multiple ways. The mirror imaging is what ensures the closest authenticity to the original. Therefore, we use the word mirror image here. So is it the same? If there is a modification, has the forensics expert explained it in the report? So in many cases, I've come across, where multiple devices are seized, they will not note down the serial numbers correctly because they're on such complicated, lengthy serial numbers. Somewhere or the other, some digits will get mixed up, or they will note down the wrong number. But many of these cases, the courts have predominantly also overlooked certain mistakes where it is properly explained. But these are all also strong grounds which can be relied on by the defense. So this is where that balance happens, where you ensure that, where every step is properly done, then that becomes just that bit tougher for the defense. But where every step may have some chink in the armor, that small chink can become a very big gap, so you have to be really careful in terms of, that's why when it comes to electronic evidence, actually it is for any evidence, the work of the prosecutor is always more difficult in that sense.
Yeah, just to add on to that, what we had seen, like, there were storage medias which were seized by a particular department. Now, when after a year or so, when it was opened for analysis, okay, we found that midway, all the files have been accessed. Actually, hash value was not created at that time. Okay. But when we saw that, they found that hash value, we found that there are a lot of files, metadata, which is showing that it was in the custody of that particular officer and it should be in the Khana. Now the question arises, like, how come a particular storage media has the files which have been accessed in the Malkhana? Has there someone removed that, opened that whole seal, connected it with a computer, browsed through the files, and we were able to show it to the officer. First of all, we were taken as, you are all saying something wrong. How can anyone enter the Malkhana and do such things and all? But when they checked the CCTV footage of that particular Malkhana, they found a particular person entering and removing that particular evidence. Okay. Even when we seize, okay, previously, as ma'am had said, I had experienced it in real life. Like, I was in an office and there was an officer who brought in monitor and printer. He said that, sir, from this particular computer, this particular document has been printed. I have seen it. We should seize it. We said, where is other system? He brought the monitor, like big CRT tube monitor is there. He brought it. This is the computer from where it has been printed. No, which is kept down that CPU. It doesn't looks good. It is not containing that. What we are seeing, that is where the document was there. So we again, that was, you go there again and bring that CPU. Another instance, what happened is, when you note down in your Panchanama, they note down the model number, serial number of the laptop. Okay. We always say that you should note down the model number and serial number of the storage media, that is the hard disk. Otherwise, what will happen means someone will change the hard disk. The laptop will be the same. It will be opened and a different hard disk will be inserted inside. and what you are searching, the evidential value, everything is zero, right?
I think Mr. Yadav, Inisa has got a question to you. Inisa ma'am,
Yes, sir.
you can ask.
Yes, sir. Sir, do we follow the British law of electronic evidence, or our Indian law of electronic evidence is unique of its own nature?
Ma'am, this is a very legal question. I won't be able to answer that. But basically, all the tools, whatever we follow in forensics and everything, it all has come from the US law only we have brought. We in India, that Napine ma'am will be able to clarify it, but from the technical part, how to handle all those things, technicality part, we are just following it from the US.
Okay. Ma'am, your comments, Napini ma'am, is the law in India is borrowed from UK or it is India's own rule, she asked.
Yes, this is the most unfortunate situation we are in. Where we borrow a law from UK, 69 of Payes-Collis and Collis Act, and at a time when they themselves already tried
Yep.
and tested the law and said it is not of any
Okay.
use. So in 1999, Section 69 of Payes Act was repealed.
Oh,
And the UK Law Commission clearly recorded that it serves no purpose. And this is the law which we have adapted under 65A and B. So when you ask the question about electronic evidence and laws, it can be a little misleading because again, you are equating electronic evidence with 65A and B. Inisa, you can't assume that electronic evidence is that narrow a perspective, you know. It is with respect to secondary evidence, with respect to electronic evidence, that 65B comes in and where it lays down certain ground rules for acceptance thereof. Remember, we have a whole law apart from that, which is, you know, and several provisions which unfortunately get ignored in the process of this restriction on 65A and B. And let me tell you where the genesis is. It's so fascinating because one of the earliest, see, I came into cyber laws before India got its cyber law, and maybe because of that, I always keep talking about the broader perspective, you know, because it was a very slow start and then burst, you know, of activity that has happened all over the world. One of the earliest things that happened in the field of cyber were model laws that came out. So what actually the IT Act and the Evidence Act draws on heavily when we talk electronic evidence, not just about a certificate. When we talk about electronic evidence, when we talk about these three fundamental principles of authenticity, integrity, and non-repudiation, the exact wording also in terms of the use of non-repudiation as opposed to something which you cannot deny, you know, all of this comes from the model laws for electronic signatures. So when you look at even a lot of the definitions, we have drawn heavily from this model law, UNCITRAL model law. So if you go and do a comparison, in fact, if you read my book, you will get a lot of these comparisons also. I have actually done section to section comparison in my book, you know. So if you read the chapter on electronic evidence, you will get an answer on that.
Napini ma'am, you have to add one more word in your book with best compliments from Napini.
So I have written the book with compliments from me. If I have to give it to everybody with my compliments.
No, I want the book as a compliment from you to the readers.
Yes, that it is. In fact, you know, so it's very interesting. When I wrote the book, this is exactly what I said when somebody, I think it was in the Hindu interview after the Chennai launch, where I told them that I called my whole, you know, the holy grail of writing the book was to democratize cyber. Because everybody seems to think this field of cyber or electronic is the domain of few. It cannot be that. It has to be the domain of everybody.
Everybody.
So the whole idea of writing the book, and I wrote it so late, despite the fact that I've been in it from 95, is to democratize it, to make sure that all these lovely youngsters will take up cyber laws as their main, you know, a field of expertise. It's so important. And I hope that this session will also inspire some people to do that.
I too join with you, Napini ma'am, in your vision hub. And I request Yalini to post this question. Yalini, the question is to whom, sir or ma'am?
My question is to you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Whenever we produce such electronic records, how do we ensure that the same will be admitted by the courts?
I thought
Admissibility.
that's what we just spoke about all this time. I told you already, no? Follow the same first principles. Make sure that you have covered every link to the chain of custody. And remember again that what you're really doing is only for the document to be admitted. After that, you still have to prove the truth of the contents. Otherwise, in all the exchanges we had for today's session, I could have just slipped in one very quiet message to Mr. Srinivas Raghavan saying, you owe me 1 crore. And I know all the ways of ensuring that 65B4 certificate is properly given, and I can rely on that message and have it marked as an exhibit. That does not mean that Mr. Srinivas Raghavan owes me 1 crore, right? Yeah, all that it means is that I sent the message to him on so-and-so date at so-and-so time. After that, what I have said in the message, is that correct or not, is something which I still have to prove.
True.
You have Supreme Court judgments on proving or, marking a document as exhibit as opposed to proving the truth
Proving
of the
document.
contents. And if you look at those judgments, it will specifically refer to the phrase, the correctness of the contents. That's the wording it will use. So many times in many of these sessions, especially when I'm addressing judges, they will raise this issue in that in 65B2, they are using the words that once you comply with these conditions, the correctness of the contents is proven, therefore what you're saying is wrong, that the truth of the contents has to be proven. So then I rely on general case law to show that no, when you use this phrase correctness of contents, it only means the integrity of the document. The truth of it still has to be proven. I will just put the link of the citation of this case, Jaimin Jewelry, in which the Bombay High Court also clarified it in the terms of electronic evidence.
May I request Akshaya to post the question? Is it to the ma'am or to sir?
To ma'am again.
Yeah.
Sorry to be bombarding you with questions.
No, not at all. It's always a pleasure. And Yogendra, please feel free to chip in even if
Yeah,
the
sure.
question is posed to me. Yeah.
Ma'am, what do you think? Do you think the currently applicable provisions are dynamic or flexible to accommodate fast evolving technological advancements? And if they aren't, what would you suggest as the way forward?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but it was not dynamic to begin with only. Right. So even when you look at the IT Act, one of the biggest changes they had to do in 2008 was to change all the words wherever they use the word digital to electronic, because they froze technology at that point of time. And it is very sad because, when you look at the whole policy making or law making process in India, from its beginning to when we actually see the law before us, there is a huge gap. I mean, with me having involved myself in policy making and in assisting in the drafting of laws over the last, I think, about 5 years now or more, 6 years, I have realized the entire process, and I can tell you it is so much easier being on the other side. It is so easy to criticize. It's so difficult to actually do the job, So it's a very difficult task. So one of the things that comes to me, or which, comes to the fore for me, when I look at the IT Act itself, Information Technology Act, your Akshaya is asking, and with Mr. Jayakumar, her uncle being a specialist in tax laws, I better clarify what is the IT Act here. So in Information Technology Act, and in the, when IT Act 2000 came out, in its schedule, IPC and Evidence Act were also amended, and that's how 65A and B and all, and a lot more sections we have not yet discussed today came into the Evidence Act. All of this, we saw it in 2000, April 2000. But the drafting of it must have started at least 2 years back. And that is why, with respect to the last question that was asked also, provision which was struck down by UK still continued in our act. So when we look at what is it that it came with, the difficulties it came with, and what is it that we should look for in the future, very briefly. One, the law as it stands today, when we speak about electronic evidence, yes, it is very complicated. Could it have been accommodated in the general laws itself? I believe it could have been. The very phrase, which is the, a reproduction, a copy made through mechanical reproduction, equally applies to any copy that we rely on from an electronic device. So there was no reason for a special law to that effect. The way I look at it, and that's the irony of it here, probably 65A and B were introduced to make it easier for people to rely on electronic records than general secondary evidence, because they dispense with the notice to produce process and a lot of other issues. They also actually dispense with one of the most important things here. We tend to forget that the minute you talk about electronic records, you may have to forget the word original and copy. Because when you enter a document, when you create a document in electronic form, you may be making multiple copies of it already. We are now doing webinars, we are doing live streaming. So you get onto an online studio and then you're live streaming to multiple destinations. Which is the original then? Is it the copy that is made in that studio, the original, or that which is already on YouTube or Facebook, the original, right? So 65B3, which is not even talked about, is what actually overcomes this problem. That every copy is actually deemed to be an original and you can take a copy. So one question that didn't arise in today's session, but which most times comes up is, which is the original that you take a copy from? What is it that 65B4 certificate is supposed to prove? Answer is very simple. Whatever is there in electronic form, you give the 65B4 certificate with respect to that document. Let's say, for instance, let's take the same Twitter example I put forth. I think one of the questions also came up about snapshots and modifications to it and whatnot. See, it's very simple. And again, please go back to Ramajayam. And interestingly, Mr. Srinivas Raghavan, Ramajayam relies on Nani Palkiwala's quote. So, yeah. So what I did, in fact, I have read Ramajayam so many times for electronic evidence cases that when I wrote an article we were just discussing Nani Palkiwala's Festschrift book. When I wrote my article for that, I relied on that quote in the beginning to show about how in our quest for perfection, we sometimes tend to allow criminal elements to escape because of fear. So Ramajayam very beautifully captures Palkiwala's quote to say, let us not allow fear to rule that something may be modified. If Yogendra, I focus only on technical aspects, he can give you nightmares about the way in which electronic records can be easily modified without you being even able to show, see the difference. Because things are improving so much. Technology is moving at a super fast pace. Law cannot keep pace with it. But can law be ahead of technology? Not necessarily so. What we need is dynamism, right? So it's not that a document can be modified that counts. Has the document been modified is what counts. And in law, the first principle that the person who claims that a document has been modified has to bear the onus of proof of such modification continues to apply to electronic records as it does to any other record. So we come down to the last part of your question with respect to, is this law dynamic enough? As I said already, it was not dynamic even when it started. The intentions were good. Execution was a nightmare. Not just bad, it was a nightmare, right? We have now lived with it for 2 decades. In one of the earlier sessions where I was giving, one judge was mentioning that maybe it's very simple, we are all just getting carried away. We also used to say that. If you want to simplify it, it's very simple. because of this one statement which Anwar versus Bashir interprets, saying to the best of your knowledge. You know, so as long as the threshold level has been reduced so low that you don't even have to show how you have that knowledge to say Google Earth's satellites are working fine or Facebook servers are working fine, then it's literally nothing. So I would say, look at electronic evidence, look at 65A and B in this perspective, that it was meant to make your life easier and not more difficult. And then if you look at the conditions, and technically, according to me, it's a paper tiger. Because the minute you reduce it to that proviso to say to the best of my knowledge, then it is worthless, according to me. And therefore, my report, which I have submitted when I was part of this committee, is to do away with 65A and B. I truly believe that it is so badly drafted because even, you know, if you ask me as a good lawyer to argue the counter to what I just said, I can argue it right now also on how I can be tripped up to show that what I'm saying is it's very easy and all is not so easy. You know, let's take the other aspects. No? Who will give the certificate? The person who's in charge of the computer or the administrator. We are neither in charge of Facebook nor of its administrator. But we still rely on certificates given by users. We can be a user whose Facebook account it is. But what happens when you are giving a copy of a Twitter post, which is what I mentioned earlier, of somebody else's account? What happens when you're relying on a chat session, which is on somebody else's server, right? So there are so many issues. And please read 65B2 also so carefully. There is so much redundancy and tautology in it. 65, well, I just use tautology by saying both words, but that's lawyers for you. But if you look at 65B2, B and D, it's literally similar. And if we are to, that is why I said that I beg to differ from Anwar versus Bashir, that if we are to comply with all four, what about the slight variation between 65B2, B and D? Which one are we supposed to comply with? And is there really an inconsistency there? So there are so many issues that will arise. So the real way forward, and this is what UK adapted. UK said we would go back to common law principles in terms of electronic evidence. And we believe that this aspect of giving a certificate does not serve any purpose. And I truly believe that the minute you apply that threshold to the best of my knowledge, it is worthless. Even if you are the former Chief Justice of India and you give an opinion, why is it that courts do not rely on it? It is just to the best of his knowledge. If that is the case with an opinion, why is this law making an opinion a statement of fact, right? And therefore, according to me, this should be done away with. And when you talk about dynamism, the draftsman already had the best example before him in terms of evidence, in terms of electronic records or records rather, for him to adapt, which is the definition of the word document. Despite all the changes from a rock edict to electronic records, you did not need one word, full stop or comma change in that definition. So when we talk about dynamism, I always love to give this as the example. This is the example that the draftsman has to follow, which is keep your language simple, keep your requirements short, do not allow paranoia to rule when you are drafting, because there is no way that through drafting, you can plug every small gap that a criminal mind will come up with, because for every gap you fill, they will find 10 more. So that is not the intent and purpose of a draft. That doesn't make it dynamic. Dynamism is to be able, elastic enough to adapt to future technologies, but tight enough that it is not going to be open-ended and left to interpretation, which will ensure uncertainty only, right? The tightness has to ensure certainty, and that's what, according to me, is the true reference in Arjun Pandit Rao's case. I truly hope the Supreme Court will adapt that in formulating a larger bench and resolving all the issues with respect to 65A and B, not just 65A and B, but all questions that arise with respect to electronic evidence and reliance on them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Inisa, madam, any further questions?
No, sir. we have a peculiar situation regarding who should issue the certificate, sir. Is it possible to get a certificate from an accused for the printout taken from his email account at the time of arrest? If it is so, it is a self-incrimination. In contra, we can take it as a fact discovered under Section 27 of Indian Evidence Act. So there are some uncertainty regarding all these things. So I expect ma'am to explain these situations.
Yeah, before I start, I'm going to ask Yogendra to also come in because Yogendra and his colleagues have worked extensively with forensic labs. So Yogendra, would you like to chip in on this?
No, ma'am, from the legal point you start with, I'll come up with the technical part.
Okay, so the law is very clear. The proviso is very clear with respect to who has to give the certificate. And that's exactly what I was just explaining in my last answer also. The issue will become, so none of the judgments which have tried to create this clarity actually address it. So for instance, in Ramajam, they expanded it to show that it is not just the person whose computer or computer device or administrator, but also a service provider can give. So here the service provider will be, for instance, if you're relying using an external server like NetMagic, then NetMagic has to give the 65B4 certificate. But today is a world of cloud technology. So if you're using, let's say, an Amazon cloud, do you think that Amazon is even equipped to give millions of 65B4 certificates to people? It is not possible for them to do that. So really, even if you had to apply Ramajam or all the other judgments between Anwar to Arjun, you will see that you will not get clarity in terms of who should give this certificate. So the simple methodology that I can practically tell you is the person who is making the copy. Okay, we already discussed about what is the computer resource you're taking from. It could be anything, right? It could also be, and I'll give one example. One of the cases, the issue that comes up most for corporate entities is data theft. So almost 90% of the cases I've handled for corporate entities is in terms of data theft. It's very rare instances of external intrusions. 90% of the cases are internal intrusion, right? It could be hacking, exceeding access, just removing work they have done themselves, thinking that it belongs to them when they are leaving the company. All of these are data theft, which is punishable, etc. When we talk about the electronic evidence aspect of it, when we file our cases, the trail is very clear. In fact, this is the reason why in my book, The Technology Laws Decoded 1, I have referred to electronic evidence as the breadcrumb trail, like in Hansel and Gretel. Because as in that case, here also, the trail will be there only for that bit of time. So you have to catch it immediately. So we do it very thoroughly at the initial stage when we are filing our case, civil or criminal. The problem is the case comes up after many years, probably a decade. And we have actually handled cases where we filed these cases in, let's say, 2003, 2005, and now they've come up for trial, and at least 20 people have changed. The persons who are in charge have changed during this time. So the person who is in charge of the resources was not the person who was there when the incident happened. So who gives the 65B4 certificate? We can't go looking for the person then. There is a larger issue here, even if you find the person who was there at that point of time. The document has been moved because all of you use Gmail. Today, it is capped at 15 GB. What do you do when you have to keep using the same mail ID? You will move the content to some other electronic resource and you'll continue to use the same email ID. But you may have to rely on that mail or the attachment at some other point of time. At which point of time, what I explained to you, the chain of custody is like physical custody when it changes hands. You have to explain every single change from its origin to its production before the court. So what you're really giving the certificate for is the last leg of that electronic chain. And in that last leg, rely on the person who is taking the copy. So here we come to the criminal side of things. which is the question raised about accused. Obviously, the accused will not and cannot be asked to give. In no case will you find it. Invariably, the forensics experts are called upon to give the certificate because of two reasons. One, all the High Court judgments also point to the fact that you do not have to cross-examine the person who is giving the certificate for the certificate to be relied on. So if you take it in terms of the fact aspect in this, what you said, you will get stuck with this aspect of cross-examination. So don't go into that. Keep it simpliciter as electronic record, keep it simpliciter within 65B4, and the person who is taking the copy gives the certificate. The minute you do that, it will be a person who owns that computer resource from which he is taking the copy. It will be that person who is now a knowledgeable forensic expert who will be able to speak to the authenticity and integrity of the certificate, right? So it is only when the authenticity and integrity are contested that the cross-examination becomes necessary. So once you come to that stage, you realize that the solution may be much simpler. It is complicated, but it is not impossible, right? So you will have to exercise practicality when you're approaching this.
Any question? Any more question from anybody? Yalini?
I have a question to sir. Sir, what is the scope of challenge of admission of electronic evidence, sir? How to challenge or counter them and produced by the prosecution?
Challenges to admissibility.
Yeah, see, ma'am, basically when electronic evidence is, you are posting it, it should have the chain of custody, the methodology which has been used. Okay. Now, and the forensic softwares. Now, when we say forensic softwares, a particular person is using an, suppose, an open source. So we should try to understand what are the ambiguities in an open source softwares. Now, suppose just to explain it to you, open source is something whose source code is available to us and we can edit that particular source code so that the output may come what we desire. Okay, so that's why, and when we say licensed softwares, the source code is present with the company. Now they have coded this particular software in a way that a document file or a file with an extension of doc will be opening as a Microsoft Word file only. Okay, now suppose I have used an open source. The challenge will be, did the software which you have used can alter any other data, whether it has been tested? No, it has not been tested. So here it's a what you call I lose that particular case because I have used an open source tool. Similarly, now in India, we also have cyber forensic tools, and that's what we always suggest, that you all should go for licensed tools. In India, we have got CDAC Trivandrum. They have developed forensic tools. So all these tools you can use from CDAC or anything, but it should be a licensed tool. It should not be a freeware, because there are chances wherein suppose the defense can always argue for that this particular software is doing such thing. Now, even there was a question in the chat that computer output. Now, I can decide what a computer output can be. For example, I'll just tell you a case. In a case was there in which a particular person was hiding the tax. Okay, he had got details like, suppose you pay in cash, okay, it will be not shown in his income tax return. If you pay by credit card or you go pay by check, it will be showed in the income tax return. Now, when the officers went there, what he used to say is, sir, this is a computer generated print. So we have not altered it. But the truth is, at the background, they have developed an application which hides that particular data, and it shows only the data what they want. Even there are some of the restaurants we had seen. Some people pay by cash, some people pay by card. So cash part, they don't show it. Okay, now this, because of this, now when it goes to the court, What are the questions you can ask? Have you generated the hash value? What is the methodology? What is the chain of custody of that particular system? Now, chain of custody plays a vital role. Why? Because first it was present in XYZ place. Then how did you capture that particular system? What methodology you followed? Whether it was system was on, if it was on, how did you make it off? Okay, then which tools you have used and what is the output of that particular tool, and where have you arrived? All these things come as an you can challenge a particular defense in this. Okay, there is one more question in the chat where it was question was asked, like whether a screenshot or a photograph which has been taken, can it be admissible or not? Now, when we take a photograph, now in that particular case, I can relate it. It is like from a particular mobile phone, okay, which was done factory reset. Now, prior to doing the factory reset, a screenshot was captured. Now, in that particular scenario, a screenshot is taken as a hash value has been generated. Even on the Panchanama, it has been taken a sign of the person who had that particular phone. Also, the phone's owner, he also had signed it saying that this particular screenshot which has been taken at this particular time is a genuine one, and the mobile phone has undergone a factory reset. And in this way, that particular system was authentic.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I think most of the audience would have been highly benefited from today's session. I thank both Mr. Yadav and Ms. Napine for the time and energy they have spent with us and the immense way in which the research has been done and the session is handled. A good salute and thanks to both of you. Thank you very much, sir.